What's going on, guys? I wanted to make a video on an update for the Rabbit and getting it back on the road. If you saw the last video I uploaded, basically the Rabbit, the slave cylinder gave out on it, so I couldn't drive the car. And also before that, for a while, the clutch has been slipping. Um, it's if you're not familiar with it, the car is turbocharged. It's making, I don't really know what it's making. It's probably making around 300 horsepower and around 300 pounds of torque. I'm not sure yet. Um, Long story there, I guess. But it has a Black Forest Industries Stage 2 clutch in it. I had the clutch for a while. It was actually in the Jetta for a year or two before I got the Rabbit. So when the Jetta was rear-ended and totaled, I pulled basically all the parts off of it and sold some of it off, kept some of it. I kept the clutch. So the clutch was in the Rabbit and was holding just fine for a while. Turned the boost from 8 to 12, about 12 psi, and was still holding, but then that was before winter came, and when winter came and the temperature dropped, the clutch was like, fuck this, and basically let me know. So my original plan was to, when the car was still driving and I was kind of switching back and forth between the Rabbit and the Mark IV whenever I wanted, my plan was to save up and just kind of get South Bend. Like, there's a few options of South Bend I was looking at, and either that or a Clutch Masters FX400, and they both are, they're both hovering around 13, 14, 1500 bucks. So I was gonna get one of those because they're like essentially the best you can get without getting some like extremely race dedicated like twin disc of some sort, and I don't really have a setup that's worthy of all that stuff. So what I ended up doing was getting another Black Forest Industries clutch. So my friend Cameron, with his 2.5 turbo Jetta, I think he's making right around 400 wheel horsepower, maybe a little bit more. It's hard to say, but he recently turned the boost up to like 23 psi and was just absolutely hurting feelings out there. Even raced a bike. And he has the Stage 3 BFI clutch kit, and he loves it. Grabs like consistently. It just never gave him an issue since he's been driving the car with the boost turned up. Even all through winter, even with sticky tires, he had Mickey Thompson street radials. He had some trips to the drag strip. One of the axles that I sold him broke. One of the joints gave out, and the clutch was still perfectly fine. So that's what I ended up getting. So I'm going to switch here. And so the Black Forest Stage 3 kit is similar to the Stage 2, and I'll tell you the differences. So Stage 2 and Stage 3, they share the same flywheel, same 18.5 pound billet, single mass flywheel. The pressure plates are the same. They're both 2,500 pound pressure plates. The discs are the difference. So the Stage 2 disc that's in the Rabbit now is a full-faced, organic, sprung disc. This one is also sprung, but it's ceramic, and as you can see, the pads are spaced out. It's not a full face. This gives a little more aggressive initial bite. Not just the initial bite, but the overall clamping capacity. And also the ceramic really helps with extreme temperatures. So he's been driving it, like he doesn't drive it daily like for work or anything like that, but he drives the car at least every weekend. He doesn't use it for work because he drives for work, but he drives the car so much, he puts so many miles on it. So as of now, the Stage 3 is really proven its worthiness. So here's the disc. Be a little more close up. Of course, they say which side it needs to be on, pressure plate versus flywheel. You have, I also upgraded to the metal slave. Like typically you get a plastic housing slave cylinder. And from the stories I've heard over the years where some of them would leak some brake fluid, I decided to always avoid those, because last thing you want is brake fluid getting on your clutch disc, whether it's stock or upgraded, because then you'll start slipping and then you have to take everything apart to fix it. That was like a $70 upgrade, like real cheap. We have of course the clutch alignment tool. They give you some Loctite, medium blue. These are pressure plate bolts. These are BFI specific. They do have a different, not that the tool itself matters, you know, triple square, Allen, hex. They have a different torque spec than OEM. And these are OEM flywheel bolts, the same ones that your car comes with, and the pressure plate. 2,500 pound pressure plate. I believe stage 1 is less, stage 2 and 3 are the same. I don't remember what stage 4 consists of, but stage 5 is for sure different. So that's all that. Now I just realized that the new metal slave does not come with the 3 extra bolts. I always recommend getting those brand new as well, just because why leave any stone unturned when you're doing something so invasive like pulling the transmission, pulling the axles, pulling the transmission, possibly pulling the subframe, or you know, the axle cup, the axle flange if you want, whatever. All that work just to not get 3 new bolts and torque them down a spec. Like, it never made sense to me, so I always do it. So there's the clutch. This here is from Euro Tuning. I live real close by. They're about 20-30 minutes away, so I got this like the next day. This right here is the CTS Tuning, or sorry, CTS Turbo subframe centering kit. So it comes with most of the subframe bolts. This is probably all the subframe bolts, actually. What I like about the kit is it also includes the green bolts, the large rear section. The original bolts have threading only down here. The rest of the bolt is not threaded. It's super skinny. You could tell that it easily would be stretched out and basically useless in a matter of no time. That's what most people get the subframe clunk for. Well, subframe clunk from is those skinny bolts in the rear. They stretch out. It allows some movement, and as the rest of the bolts age as well, you'll hear a clunk from the subframe moving around. So when you upgrade these bolts to a thicker one, that does help it, but it still doesn't. It's like a band-aid, really. It'll come back eventually anyway. But by getting these bolts bigger from Audi, all new bolts, as well as collars that take up the tolerance in between the bolt and the hole, you get rid of the problem for good. It's not exactly as elaborate as a Tyrol Sport Kit. The Tyrol Sport Kit, I believe their collars, I think they have more collars. I don't know the difference on how the collars get installed one versus the other. It might be the same for all I know, but they're brass instead of billet aluminum. Now the other difference is the hardware in Tyrol Sports Kit is hardened stainless steel bolts, so they're not torque to yield like these are. Over here I have basically the entire catalog from Diesel Geek for the Mark V Rabbit. The only thing I'm missing here, which is not something that they sell, is the plastic cup that goes in here. It basically holds onto the pivoting part of the shift knob. You don't have to replace that. You don't have to replace this whole base. You don't have to do any of this. I had this from years ago, so I decided if it's all compatible, I'm gonna go ahead and use it. But everything here is from them. We have here is the new version of the Sigma 6 short shifter for 6-speed transmissions. And at first it looks identical to the first version, but there is a major difference, and it's only really aesthetic. The redesign made it to where it's easier to adjust, easier to install initially, and easier to readjust whenever you have to pull things off. Like anytime you do a clutch job, you got to take some things off, and you may have to readjust. So it makes it easier. With the first version, you had the front and side-to-side end links were these guys, where you had to have the bolts coming through the top that were Allen keys, and you had individual nuts on the bottom. And to hold the Allen key up here, you know, with your engine over here, your battery over here, everything in the kind of in the way, which I always just uninstall the battery, but you had your Allen key bolt up here, and then you're holding a little wrench down here on the bottom. It was a real pain to tighten them up and get the cable exactly where it needed to be. Readjusting it was time consuming. You know, when you put it all back together, it's nice and tight, and you go to drive it and it's off just a little bit. It's extremely frustrating. So once you get it right, it was awesome. Like, I had the first version and I loved it. I drove it for like 2 years without ever having to readjust it, and that was only because I had to take the clutch out. This new version, however, essentially has a bracket So instead of having 4 individual nuts, it's all together, all threaded. So it kind of goes just like that. You put your shift cable in here and just snug them down. A lot easier to install and readjust. You have the slider here, the super slider. I think they have a nickname for it. I think all their parts are either billet aluminum, billet steel, or Delrin. These parts last a lot longer than the plastic that comes with the Volkswagen stuff. And so the big difference with the new version is instead of having 2 of these billet aluminum end links, the front to back location is going to be your original factory plastic end link. The difference is you're going to take out the guts for it and replace it with these Delrin bushings. So just like the first version, you're going to have a perfectly precise shifter. And some people just don't like it because it's not quite aesthetically pleasing as the first version. For those that have like a tucked engine bay and it's like super nice car show type of setup, they want as much billet shiny pieces as possible, and I totally get that. But you know, if you have a nice shiny plastic end link with a new Delrin bushing in it, it still looks good. I'm all about function over form anyway, so if it's easier to use, works perfectly fine, and it's precise, I'll be totally fine with that over something that looks a little bit better and it's really hard to deal with. So of course you get your alignment pin. If you never used one before, it's kind of good that I have the base in here so I can show you. So the front of the car is over here. You have your shift knob. When you move your shift knob kind of close to second gear, it's like a little bit over here, you'll see at the base of the shifter there's a hole, and then in the base of the plastic ring that goes here there's another hole as well. You line them up and stick it down in here just like that. So once that's aligned, you can go under your hood, undo your end links from the shift cables, and then you can make your adjustments and then put them back together, tighten up the end links, and once that's all done, then you can remove your pin and you're good to go. This one is nice because they made it to have the perfect tolerance for the holes themselves. You could get like a 5 or 6 millimeter galvanized screw from Home Depot or whatever, but it's not quite as perfect as this, so it's nice that they include it. These right here are shifter shaft bushings. So under your shift knob, when you go to push it down and up for reverse and everything, you'll notice there's a spring underneath the shift knob. Well, at the base of the spring and above it, of course that fell down, at the base of the spring and above it, you have these bushings right here. So the stock ones are exactly the same as this bushing right here. This soft, transparent bushing that turns yellow over time, deteriorates, falls apart. On the shifter shaft, when they fall apart, they go into the base of the shifter, they get stuck in there, so when you push it down to go in reverse and you try to pull it back up, it gets stuck, and it's a real pain in the ass. It started to happen on the 2010 Jetta that I had. It wasn't very bad, but as I was replacing them, they started falling apart real bad from trying to scrape them out. And I drove a few Mark IVs that were just a nightmare. So in my opinion, these are an absolute must. Then you have here the first gear getter. It goes right about here. So there's a metal bracket that comes up here, tees off this way, and this first gear getter Delrin piece snaps in, takes up all the tolerance, so whenever you're going into first gear or reverse gear, it's perfectly accurate. These are the cable savers. So these go in the end of the cables underneath the shifter. As your shift cables come in from the front, enter here, these bushings hold them onto the end of the shift knob at the very base. Same thing as all the other bushings that fall apart. They're made of the same crap that gets soft and then dries out and cracks. But the problem with these the reason these are so important is when the cable saver bushings, the original bushings, when they give out, your cable will come off the base of the shifter. You can't get to it just by like lifting up your leather boot. You know, you have to take a lot of stuff apart. So when it comes off, you can't drive the car, you're stuck. So I actually have a video on replacing those. It was about 2 years ago, I think. I was in the shop that I worked at and had the Jetta up on a lift. So you actually have to remove the exhaust. You have to remove the heat shield tunnel above that. And then the base for this right underneath has tabs that each section it folds over. When you pry them off with a flathead, you can drop the lower cover off. Sorry, got some hiccups. The lower cover comes off, you'll see all the bushings fall out on the floor. Mine was really bad, and they didn't even fall off. Like the car was perfectly drivable, but the bushings were falling off like crazy, so it was a matter of time. You snap these on, nice Delrin material, and you never have to worry about it again. And then last thing here for Diesel Geek is the super pin. Now, at the time that I was dealing with this, Diesel Geek did not have this. On my 2010 Jetta, the parts are similar to the Mark 6 actually in 2010. I believe 2009, I believe is still Mark 5 specific, but for my case, I could not get my initial pin out. I was going to replace the bushings in here, but I couldn't get my pin out because it had like a rivet or a head over it. So I didn't want to drill it out because there was no replacement pin, you know, so it would have been loose, it would have came out. So I just had to deal with it and stick with what I had. Now that they have this, they actually sell this billet piece of aluminum that you get with it. So with your original pieces in here, you clean it up and JB weld it there. And once it dries and cures, and it's perfectly lined up, you get a drill bit, you drill the head off of the bolt, you push it out, and you replace the whole thing with this guy. Polished billet steel with locking nuts on each side. They're not nylon nuts, but they're pressed so they lock when you get them nice and tight. And then the plastic or Delrin bushings that take up the other slack on the ends. So everything here pretty much makes it to where the driving experience is really improved because everything's so precise. And I've always liked having a completely perfect feeling shifter, especially if it can keep you from grinding when you're shifting fast. That's the best thing in the world. These right here are just the generic bushings I got. I got them from Cameron. Someone made them, and they're just the cable bracket bushings. So the shift cable bracket is what sits on top of the transmission. There's 3 bolts to hold it down in place, and then these replace that. So they're super easy to put on. I figured why not? One last step. So that's my plans right there. Now that I have everything, the only thing I'm actually missing is I do have to buy a new torque wrench. The one I had, I dropped it a few times, and there was one time, I'll admit, I got super mad and I slammed it on the ground like an idiot. But it wasn't like a very expensive one. So I gotta buy a new torque wrench to do all this. So maybe next week I'll grab one of those, maybe a nice digital one. But what I'm missing besides that is the only hardware I need now is I want to replace the bell housing bolts, I want to replace the transmission mount bolts, and I need to get the 2 bolts for the axle hub bolts. Yeah, those guys. So that's it. I'm also planning on making a video for each of the parts. I want to make like a little how-to on them, except for the cable savers, since I already did that a couple years ago. I'm going to make a little video for each other thing on showing you how to install them, and I'm going to make a video on like a review of them, see what difference it makes, how it feels, especially because right now everything in the Rabbit driveline wise is stock minus the transmission mount and the clutch itself, like, and the dog bone mount, like. But everything else bushing wise, it's all factory, and it's actually still in pretty decent condition because the car has like 86,000 miles on it. But I'd rather replace it all now anyway and not have to worry about it because I'm sick and tired of it breaking, and God forbid it leaves me stranded somewhere, you know. So after I do all this, since I pretty much have all the parts, after I get all this installed and everything, my next goal is to get it tuned. And actually right here, I have a gigantic 4-inch Pro MAF that's going to be going in the car as well. I've been running on a stock mass airflow sensor since I got it. And the stock mass airflow sensor does not like 12 pounds of boost. It doesn't get really accurate readings. So I'm going to swap that in there. Now, for anyone who has a mass airflow sensor car that wants to, you know, you can be boosted without any of this, but if you want to run like 12 PSI or more, what you need is to go Pro MAF, and you also need to get an air intake temperature sensor from a Mark III VR6 model. It's a 2-pin. And you basically get an aluminum bung, you weld it in your charge pipe. I welded it in somewhat close to my throttle body. It's about 1.5 feet away, I think. So you tie in the wiring from the new Pro MAF to your original MAF harness, and then you tee in the air intake temperature sensor. and then your map sensor stays wired just as is. And so when I get tuned on all that stuff, I'll hopefully be around 16 to 18 psi, since I have the Audi RS4 fuel pump as well. And I think that's where the car is going to stay, because I don't plan on building the motor. So that's it. That's all I got for you. Until then, until I make videos on installing it and reviews and stuff like that, I'll see you next time. So have a good one.